So who hates release time? I hate release time. It sucks for me as a dev manager. It sucks for the product managers. They always want to get some new feature in, and I have to say, no, you can't do it. It sucks for the engineers. They've got to be wrapping everything up. They want to focus on some more interesting stuff. They can't do that now. It sucks for everyone. So I am very interested in this topic. It prevents us having to do all these things, all these nasty things at the end of the release, and makes my life a lot easier. So I'm going to start talking initially about the existing processes we've had at Atlassian. They've been fairly consistent across the products for a while now, but they're changing rapidly and speeding up. I'm going to talk a bit about the benefits of continuous delivery, because I know while most people are sold on it, there are still quite a lot of naysayers, especially for an installed product like we have. We're not a SaaS company by any means. We have a few SaaS offerings, but the bulk of our products is still behind the firewall. I'm going to talk about the approaches to achieving it, what we've been doing, how we can help you out, and finally about the Atlassian tools and how they fit in and what we're doing there and our roadmap, how we can help other people achieve continuous delivery. So the current process we have is long-lived features all live on a separate branch. So sometimes they span greater than our standard release time, which is 98 days, and they'll all come in at some point in some sort of big bang. This causes us a lot of problems. We try to stick to the 98-day releases, but the big feature branches coming in always cause us pain through a number of reasons. And it's often not obvious with even a 98-day release cycle, which is fairly rapid for, I think, installed products. There's still a huge problem that comes with that, which isn't often apparent. So I gave a presentation, I think 3 months ago or so, to our engineering department about what we'd been doing, our 98-day releases, how well they were going. And a lot of people thought there wasn't a problem. You know, we're going faster than we were before, which I think was something like 6 months, between 3 and 6 months, depending on the product. And I don't think they appreciated that even 98 days can be an eternity. So one of the biggest slides from that presentation I've added in here. I've taken out some of the details, but it really hit home. So the timeline for a release for us is 98 days. So if I commit some code and I want it to go out to the customer, I've got to wait probably 98 days, depending on where it is in the release cycle. And 98 days is quite a long time. What is it, between 3 and 4 months? Things can change a lot in there. And we thought, well, 98 days is not bad. But then if you actually look at it, we roll our stuff out to Studio. So you can extend that because we need to integrate it into Studio, and it takes us maybe another month or so. So that boosts up to about 140 days, I think. And then if you think about it a bit further, we have integration products, which they have to be developed before the release. So they're on another 98-day schedule, things like UPM, UAL, which get rolled out into the product. So then you can extend that even further. So you've doubled that up to 200 days odd. But then if you really think about it, the time that the actual customer is using that stuff, they've got to upgrade. You can add on a lot more time for them to upgrade, and you're looking at probably a year from the time that you commit to the time that they're actually using your stuff, which is really a long time considering only a 98-day release cycle. So we really wanted to speed this up. There's other problems with this, which I will quickly go into. I think one of the biggest ones is the risk you have associated with code that has not been run. Essentially code that's sitting in source control, no one's used, it's being untested, it's all going to hit in one go. When you merge it in, support is going to pay, you're going to pay with all your merging pain to get it into there, and things are going to clash, you're going to get all these problems. Everyone attempts to do continuous integration, but you often can't if you've got some feature that goes off on some branches. You also spend a lot of time planning for the fact that it's all going to go in, you're not going to be able to revert, your customers are going to upgrade, so you've got to get it right first time. So you've got to put in all these safeguards all the time, and you spend all your time checking and double checking to make sure that everything works first time, which is a problem. It hurts your development speed in a real way. The last thing I'll mention as well, which is probably familiar to a lot of people, is the large release anti-pattern. When you have a large release, you start getting towards the end, and then your product manager comes along, and he's like, oh, I really need to get this feature in. And I'm like, I don't think we can really get it in. He's like, oh, no, we can just delay it a bit, and we'll get it in. Because he knows that he's going to have to wait another 98 days. So he wants to cram his feature in, so it pushes out the deadline a bit. You know, maybe it's 150 days then, so he's got his feature in. Then you come to the next release, and he's like, oh, I'm going to have to wait another 150 days? No, I've got to get more stuff in now, because I'm going to have to wait for so long. So it just exacerbates the problem. And we want to go the opposite direction, and you get drawn to making them longer. We want to make them shorter. I'd like to touch on branching as well. It's generally seen as a good thing. I think to isolate your changes, we've come to see it as a bad thing. We spend so much time on merging features from the branches. For an example, the 4.0 branch of Editor, we would spend, I think it was a day every week, merging the changes. It was a bit easier with Java because we could compile it. The JavaScript, however, we would only find the problems at runtime, and some things would get merged in when they weren't supposed to. You'd merge it in again, and you'd get it in again when you weren't supposed to, and it caused us so much problem. So we hated that. Going back, we would have opted to not do that on a branch. It's definitely more engineering effort to not do it that way, but we would have picked that. Branching prevents iterative development. If I can continue merging, but if I'm not deploying that anywhere and no one's using it, there's no way I can actually iteratively develop that, right? As I say, I've got to do it in one go. And as I mentioned, the big bang and the merging pain that we saw as well. And one of the last reasons is everyone does continuous integration, right? You don't want to leave this horrible process to the end where you're having to do all this work you can't estimate because everything hits at the end, and it's the same reason. If anything, it's even worse. I know in environments where you have one customer, if you're working, say, for a client and developing a custom system for them, it often gets to the point where you do a deployment and you shut everything down over the weekend, and you come in and you try and build your major production system, try and do your update, and something goes wrong because you never do it, and you end up building this delicate snowflake of all these bits that you've sort of done. And it's the worst possible time to be doing that because you're stressed, because you've got to get it done that weekend, and it's just a bad thing to do. Actually, out of interest, who does use continuous integration here? Pretty much everyone, yeah. So the first thing we did at Atlassian, we sped up our release cycles. So 98 days we thought was pretty good, and we'd brought that down to 98 days, but we thought we needed to speed this up a bit more. So just as an aside, I want to mention Dogfooding. I think most people here probably know what it is. We're very lucky to be able to use all our products. So we use all our products every day, and that gives us a huge benefit. It means that we get feedback all the time, we can deploy things, it's used immediately, we can get feedback instantly. We'd often clash with IT wanting some stability, us wanting the flexibility and changing and trialing things, and they don't like us a lot of the time, but it works out to everyone's favor, I think, in the long run. Actually, that's another question. Who here uses their own stuff? Who gets to dog food their own stuff? Anyone? Pretty good, about half. So we sped up our deployments from 98 days. So we have a main company dogfooding server, extranet, which is used for the whole company. We deploy fortnightly to that. Fortnightly drops to that server, and it takes us, I think, about 2 days as it goes through QA and stuff. This is what we did. And then we have a team dogfooding server. So just the Confluence team and the QA team are on the same server, and we deploy to that every night, or we sped it up to deploy every night. And we also sped up our stable actual releases to customers to every fortnight. So as I mentioned, it was similar problem before to this whole horrible process at the end, and it took long. I think it took a day or two to do a release. Speeding that up to doing it fortnightly gave us a lot of benefits. The whole agile, if it hurts, do it more. It worked for us here. It just made us automate it. So now we hit a button, it generates all the stuff we want. It tags in source control. Well, Maven does that for us. Uploads in Maven, does the release in Jira, Confluence. It pushes things to plugins.atlassian.com, to the website, does all that stuff for us, which makes things a lot easier, so we're happy to release a lot more quickly. It doesn't give us more features, it just means that we can release that much more quickly. So if someone calls up and there's some support problem, we can fix it and we can get the fix out to them that much more quickly. It's often the next week they'll have a version, which is great. So this is what we've been doing previously, but to get onto the main topic, moving forward is continuous delivery. So we sped things up to fortnightly, daily, but we're really pushing. We want to get that time down from commit to it being used right down. So a quick definition here. So the continuous delivery and continuous deployment are often used interchangeably. They're not quite the same thing. They're very similar. Continuous delivery is to have a binary, have something production ready, available to put into production at the press of a button. Continuous deployment is to actually keep doing that, to deploy every time you've got it ready. So they're slightly different. And generally, the push to production is probably done by a business need as opposed to, there shouldn't be a technical limitation as to why you can't do that. So why would you want to do this? This is like a lot of effort, right? So I'm going to go through some reasons as to why this is a benefit. It's been a big benefit for the product here. So as I mentioned before, there's no features that are waiting, that are sitting there, that you're waiting to get out. Often PMs like to get all their stuff in there, and they want it to go out to customers to validate whether it actually works. So you're not going to have to wait for any of this stuff. Decoupling the whole marketing about the versions, leave that to marketing. Don't have the engineers have to do that and wrap everything up at the end. Keep those things separate, keep the engineers running the whole time, and then just when it's convenient to market, when you've got a good enough bunch of features, release it. We've noticed that great momentum is awesome. If you keep going, we've achieved so much in Confluence recently, and just the momentum of adding more and more things, adding bug fixes, fixing stuff up, is huge, and it means that customers are not so worried if they find a bug. They know that it's going to be fixed relatively quickly. We brought out 3.5 recently, and we rewrote all the back end to do the whole LDAP sync. It does all this stuff. There has been problems with some particularly large customers, but we've been able to fix them very quickly and get the stuff out, and they've been incredibly happy about it. A huge benefit for products is that you can actually validate stuff. So when a change goes out, you can iteratively develop it, and you can choose whether you actually want to do it. If it's awesome, then double down. Put all your effort into that feature. People like it, work on it. If it's not, don't be afraid to just rip it out. You can trial these things, and you don't want this bucket full of all these features that no one used, that you have to maintain. It's worth actually looking to see if it changes, if it's worthwhile, and also having the ability to go back and pull it out and make changes based rapidly upon what you're actually doing. And external to the team as well, agility, the market may change. You may want to have to change direction, something else comes up. You can easily reallocate your team, reallocate resources, move stuff around if you need to, if there's a need for it, whereas previously, if you're halfway through a release and you're halfway through features, you've taken the whole thing apart, you need to put it back together again, you just can't do that. There's huge benefits for engineering as well. It's awesome to be able to build what people want. Every engineer wants to build something that people use, right? And if you don't know that, or if people don't use it, that's not very good. This allows you to do this because you can immediately see. You can see if people are using it, and you can quickly react, and if they're not using it, do something else. You can assess the value. As long as you're monitoring what is happening, that feedback cycle has been tightened up so much. I mentioned time waiting in queue. The code becomes very fragile if it sits there and it's not being used. If you can keep rolling small changes out that is always tested, and you immediately get feedback on whether there's problems there, you should be able to fix that stuff quickly and keep the fixes going in such that that code is, by the time it comes out, it's already battle tested. You don't want some big feature that's never been used that you just dump the whole thing into trunk or however you're doing it, and it's not good. Smaller batches, as I mentioned, it's taking us a day to integrate things from the 4.0 branch. We did not like that. Smaller things are much better. They're little things happening all the time, where they're coming in from other branches as well. I would encourage, if you've got other products merging onto your branch, if they're doing small changes all the time and deploying them, that they adhere to the same thing, and there's always the small integration problem. So we have other things, activity streams. There was a presentation here a couple of presentations ago, and the new version of that, they're doing the same thing. So they know if they make changes, they can put them into our code base and see the changes occurring very quickly. Finally, it just gives the team more focus. If the team is working and if you make a commit and it goes out and people start using it immediately, you're completely focused on getting that thing done and seeing the people use it. You're completely motivated by seeing your change being used, and you try and work on things that you see are useful. If that's not the case and you're working on something that isn't going to be released for a year, I mean, it's so easy to get sidetracked and go down some path and, oh, I'll do this refactor here, this is awesome. It's great to see the feedback and see people actually immediately use your stuff. It keeps the team really focused on delivering the most important things. So, our story of how we've actually accelerated these things further. So I mentioned we got down to, I think, fortnightly and nightly deployments. We've started to speed this stuff up even more. So I'm going to talk about how we've done that, especially for an installed product and where we're going. It may apply to you. It's generally seen that this is a big thing for SaaS companies. I don't know, Flickr deployed 20 times a day or something, and I know Facebook is very, very famous for this. Installed product, not so much, but we are heading in that direction, and we really want to lead the way here, I suppose. Single clients as well, it's a common one. Single clients can and should use continuous deployment. So our progress so far, one of the first things we did was split all our work into very small user stories. I can't stress this anymore. So I was in the Agile panel yesterday, and there were some people there talking about struggling to estimate because their stories were big, and you just can't have big stories. If a big story requires you to essentially dismantle the stuff you're doing, do some work, and then reassemble it. In that dismantle state, it cannot be shipped. So you don't want to do that. Make sure your stories are small. There is the option, as I said, to go on branches, but you don't really want to do that because then you lose all these benefits. So avoid them. Just break the stories down. There's always a case when something can be done in a smaller step. Open the door. The first step can be walk towards the door. It can always be broken down, and you should attempt to keep the stories down. We always try and keep our stories less than 2 days. So probably a day is the average story. We've removed all branches. So as I mentioned, 4.0, we would, looking back, have not done it on a branch. The other one, the other big one is the new user backend for 3.5. We wrote that also on a branch. It took us a year or so. Looking back, we would not have done it on a branch. We had to, again, it was the same case. We had to make sure we tested absolutely everything, make sure we completely reduced the risk, and we could have avoided all that and actually been using it as we developed it if we'd have done it on trunk. It would have been more difficult. I mean, with 4.0, it would have also been more difficult, but we could have had some incremental system such that some pages are wiki markup, some pages are XHTML, or some spaces. Definitely more engineering effort, but to immediately be getting that feedback would have been awesome. So some of the other things that we've done, which are definitely prerequisites, is we've accelerated our builds a lot more. There's a variety of techniques we've used here. I'll go into them. And we've implemented an automated deployment system. So we hit a button, we can deploy a new version onto all our servers. So I'd like to talk about the pipeline. So pipeline is a commonly used term in continuous delivery. It's essentially the pipeline of I make a commit, I run a sequence of builds, it hits some server, goes through various gates, hits servers, gets pushed through environments, and that's the pipeline of your code. So a tip here is make sure your environments are homogeneous, make sure they're all the same, basically. Don't use different binaries for different environments. It will be painful in the future. Make sure you don't do that. Configuration, maybe you need some configuration, but make sure everything is checked in. We have our Dogfooding environments, as I mentioned, a team server, a company server. We also have confluence.atlassian.com, which is the external server, which isn't yet in this process, but we aim to bring that in, so then that will be essentially the next level. We've also batched our build pipeline. So now our tests run in batches to speed things up. The next slide, I'll come on to that. We also have smoke tests so that when an environment is deployed, we can tell if there's any problems. So we'll run automated tests to make sure everything looks good. And we've actually implemented an automated rollback. If we find problems on something that we've immediately deployed, it can just roll it back to the previous version. So the continuous integration stuff, as I mentioned, we've really sped that up. So we had tests that ran a few hours. I think Jira's done the same thing. They had exactly the same problem. And what we've done is we've batched those tests up. So I think we run 11 batches in parallel now for our main tests, and the time could come down further. I think it's about half an hour. We'd like to reduce it down to 5 minutes or something, but we're working on that. One of the problems you'll find is that as you scale out horizontally, you tend to hit the constant things which cannot be subdivided, such as your source control checkout, unless you're passing your artifact. Potentially machine spin-up time. We build a lot of stuff on EC2 to allow us scaling as much as we want. There's Maven artifact download time. There's all these things which occur on every agent, so you start to push that limit. And then if you're building on something like EC2 or your own infrastructure, you'll start to push cost limitations on how much actual power you have to build all this stuff concurrently. And one way we've mitigated that is we have stages. So we'll run the unit test first. They're quick. They can run on one machine. If that fails, we don't bother running the rest of the stuff. UI tests and functional tests are other stages, and it's worth trying to parallelize these things, but do put them in some sequence such that you can cut down on costs and you don't just run everything for every commit, because, well, unless you've got a small project, you're going to run out of capacity fairly quickly. I'd like to point out Bamboo as well supports EC2. We've switched to using that because we've added Windows support as well. And previously we were avoiding EC2 because I know Bamboo only had Linux support, and we're a very, very Unixy, Macy company, not so much Windows, but we've added that in now, so we've switched to it. So what's this actually achieved for us? We previously had 1 to 2 days effort to deploy every 2 weeks. We would deploy onto a QA system. We would get the sysadmins to deploy that stuff, to check it. We'd look at get the QA guys to look at it, make sure it's okay, and then move it onto the main servers. It was not a very pleasant process, and if we had problems with it, we'd have to roll it back, and then maybe by a week later, we'd get the new version out. It's very slow. So now, 25-minute build, takes 15 minutes to deploy, 10 minutes of which is actually a notification that goes out to tell people that we're going to do a deploy, and then we don't have any downtime now. We can flip over from one Confluence instance to an upgraded version without actually taking it down. We're doing this currently about approximately 10 times a day. It depends on how many people commit. It's been up to 30 times a day, but no one notices. It's awesome. It's great for QA as well. They immediately know if a feature is, they can immediately test a feature because they can just look at that system. So Bamboo has been a great help here because Bamboo is heading in the same direction as Confluence and very much focused on continuous delivery. They've added tasks recently, so we have a deployment task. plan variables and parameterized builds are incredibly useful, so you can pass along revision numbers, version numbers from builds, such that you can always be tracking the same build, so you know which server you're getting deployed to. They've added artifact parsing as well, so you can pass your artifacts on along. You don't want to rebuild it in every stage. And manual stages is something which has been added for 3.2. And in case people aren't aware of what that is, that essentially allows stages towards the end of your process to be triggered manually, such that you could have the first build deploy to your QA system, and then a manual stage to deploy it to another staging environment, UAT environment, production maybe, and you manually trigger those stages if you're happy with that build. So talking about these stages, I want to mention what I call delivery gates. Well, gates and checkpoints within this process. So we're lucky in that we've automated everything, but I'm aware that a lot of places don't have that sort of freedom. Especially larger companies, there's various processes that have to be followed, approvals that have to be given, and they tend to be a problem. My advice is try and get rid of them. Most of the time they exist because they've always been there, because people are afraid. And you can often automate part of them. Maybe you need to submit some form to some system, to someone to sign off. If you can, automate the form submission. Automate as much as you can, and hopefully at some point they will realize where their system is no longer needed. If you're submitting these things all the time, people are ticking them off, you can work to get these things taken out. As I say, try and automate everything. One big thing I want to talk about with relation to branches is that it's often difficult to develop something when it's not ready. Some things lend themselves well to incremental development, some things do not. It's very difficult to just drop something in half-finished. It may be replacing an existing feature, and it may only be half-finished, and it's very difficult then to do it. So we use dark features, or feature switches as they're often called. We've built a system into Confluence now, so similar to about config in Firefox, with switches where things can be turned on and off. There's a Facebook video, actually, if people are interested in this. There's a Facebook video, and they do this amazingly well. They have a system where they can roll out to only males between these ages in this region, and 5% of them. So they can just push features to certain areas. We don't have that much capability. We don't need to do that yet, but we have the capability such that certain features will be developed. They'll only be visible to the developer. Then they'll expand them to the team when they're a bit more stable, and then when they're really happy with them, they'll expand it to the rest of the company. And these are done by just switches, just effectively a feature that just says, am I turned on, am I not? There's huge benefits to this. It decouples your deploy and launch entirely. So if you're developing this stuff, again, why should you be the one? Why should the developers be tied to all the marketing stuff? You develop it, let marketing switch on when they need to. Completely decouples these things. It also reduces risk because the code that you've actually developed has been running. Some of it, with some users, it's not actually running for them, but it's running for part of your users, and it's in the code base. It's not just a new bit of code that's dumped onto the code base. So I have a slide about monitoring as well. We're just getting into this. There's various ways you can monitor your application, but as I mentioned, you want to be getting feedback. You want to know if you've just done a deployment, if it's going to work, if it's working, if it's improved, commenting, if it hasn't. Make sure you get monitoring there. I've put a few examples here. Splunk, log file analysis monitoring, aggregates lots of stuff. There's various application instrumentation monitoring tools. And we also use New Relic, which is a JVM SaaS monitoring solution, which essentially you can log into their site and look at all your requests, request times, all your JVM metrics. It's incredibly useful. Essential, I would say, for continuous deployment. So we faced a few challenges here. I haven't gone into methodology at all. So the Confluence team has been using Scrum for a while now, with 2-week iterations, which corresponded to those 2-week deployment drops onto our company servers. We now, deploying multiple times per day, don't need that 2-week cycle. As it happens, the teams have diverged. Some are still using Scrum. They find the benefits of Scrum incredibly useful. Some are using Kanban. My point here is that it doesn't really matter. As long as you have a gate which allows that process, which allows that build to be good or not good, essentially tests, then it doesn't matter whether you're at the end of your Scrum sprint or not. If the code is green, awesome. If it's not, doesn't matter. So shouldn't be a problem. Downtime I mentioned, we actually have 0 downtime, so we can deploy Confluence. I would love to be able to roll that out to you guys so that you can upgrade your versions of Confluence without taking any downtime. However, it doesn't support schema changes, and most of our version upgrades do, so unfortunately we can't do that. Code and test discipline is something that's challenged us as well. Sometimes you can code something up and you haven't tested it in its entirety. So it's committed, the test will go green, but the tests weren't testing that, and you may not want to roll that out. Currently, we do post-commit code reviews. So pre-commit code reviews is a possibility. We have an alternative solution to that, which I'm going to come to, but that is definitely a challenge to us. And the final one is tracking the changes. Previously, when we did major releases, it's easy to know what's gone into that release. You can just say so, but you can see it in Jira. It's very difficult now because this thing is constantly evolving. Is this thing fixed in this version? What about on that server? It's very difficult to tell these things. I have a slide of tips, which I've mentioned a few of them. So environment independence is key. Make sure that all your environments are the same. Make sure that your stuff is checked in. So I've put version everything here, especially the deploy scripts. Additionally, the environment configurations. Make sure everything is checked in. Make sure it's all version. Don't let these things live as they often do on some file share somewhere. It's not good to do that. Another advantage is modular code. I've heard it termed branch by abstraction online. Essentially, allowing sub-teams or people to work on things without affecting each other means you can avoid branching a lot more easily. And finally, expect team changes. We've seen in Confluence essentially the compression of roles. I mean, DevOps potentially, we have had more developers involved in the actual deployment and handling of the systems, their day-to-day running. They're learning more about this stuff, which means they have less time to develop, but it means they know more what needs developing because they are seeing exactly what's going on. QA as well. They're doing a lot with their own QA because it's a lot more difficult to get the QA, a separate QA team involved in this tight loop. So it tends to be that we've found teams, we get generalist teams made of specialists, which tends to be the best way, I think. So we have a lot more plans. The future, for us, we're going to really speed things up further, and we're going to try and give some of the benefits back to you guys. So initially, what we have to do is push out all these changes to Studio. Currently, we have a team server. We roll out onto the company server. We need to push those out to Studio. So how many people are on Studio here? A few. So we're going to be pushing these things out to Studio. So Studio users are probably going to get the features before all the installed products at some point, which will allow us to validate them a lot more. They get the benefit of it first, and it allows us to then have it all finished and finalized for when we actually release behind the firewall. So one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, because this has been a huge, huge benefit for my team. I'm not such a... I used to be a developer, so I'm very interested in the technical solutions to solving, I suppose, the development speed and any team problems. And this has been such a huge benefit that the next level for me, which I'm working on now, is to actually base our deployments on issues, drive everything from Jira. So when you've got a piece of code, you want it to be sent out to a system. However, when is that piece of code ready to send out? What's the atomic unit? So it used to be a whole release gets deployed. And as I've said, this is not so good. Feature, maybe, based upon feature branches, there's problems there too. Currently, we're doing it per commit, which tends to be the more common way of doing it. The problem with this, as I mentioned, were sometimes you commit something and you haven't written tests for it yet. So it goes out and it may be a problem. You may not want it on there. So I thought, well, what's the best atomic unit? When is something ready and when is it not ready? Well, it's when it's ready in Jira. If you have a ticket, if you have a bug, if you have a story, when you finish that story, that's when it's ready. That's when that code should go out. So what we're actually looking to do in Confluence, we've already started down this track, is to basically push things out based upon whether it's done. So in this example, I have one branch with a number of commits across a number of issues. If issue B is marked done, we want to be able to pluck all those changes and then deploy them. The other changes, A, C, and D here, E, we don't want to deploy them. They may be half done. So we want to leave them on our branch and not deploy. So we're actually aiming to do this, to be able to pluck. There's various methods we can do this with, and Bamboo are looking to add support for this. This will allow such that when you finish on your issue, you mark it as done in Greenhopper, in Jira, whatever, then that stuff can get immediately deployed. It also means that the tasks we add in Bamboo can talk back to Jira and say, yeah, this thing has been deployed, this thing is done, it's been deployed to server A, B, and C, and it's now awaiting deployment to this stage. And any user that files this problem can immediately see how this is being tackled and at what point this change, this fix has made it. So they know immediately, they'll get notified when the system they're interested in gets the fix deployed. So as I mentioned, this is future. We're going to add this stuff to Bamboo, and hopefully it's going to be able to help you guys. I think this is a step ahead of the commit-based process, which most people are using at the moment, but we're very bullish on this and hoping it's going to work out very well. So in summary, we've reduced our time from 2 weeks to 30 minutes deployed. This is huge. I mentioned all the benefits. Do it for your team. It's massive. The frequency as well. We can see our changes come up. We don't have to wait for all this stuff. Be prepared for your processes to change. We've definitely had changes in process. As I mentioned, some teams have now switched to Kanban instead of Scrum. There's other things that they're aware of. They have to be more aware that the changes they're making are going to be deployed immediately. But that's actually a good thing. It means they're more careful. It means they're really thinking about what they're doing. I'd like to point out that Atlassian tools are easy to automate. It's great that we have remote APIs for almost everything, and obviously we're good at writing plugins for our own stuff too. But even for you guys, using our tools, they're also extensible. They fit into this process very well. Continuous delivery, especially for Bamboo, there's a big push there. So expect to see more and more features coming out of Bamboo to help any continuous delivery stuff you want to do. And stay tuned. Does anyone have any questions? You put your hand up first. Yep. Yep. Oh, so we use post-commit review. There's arguments for both sides. So the problem with a post-commit review in this situation is that if you commit something and it's reviewed post-commit, by that time it's too late. It's already on the branch, and if you're deploying on every green build, that's going to get deployed. So this is why we're aiming for this situation where only things that are done, so the review stage, so our review stage is part of our workflow, so only once that has been reviewed will that thing be deployed. So you could use pre-commit reviews, but then you get the disadvantage then that stuff is it's slower to get out, right? It doesn't make it onto the branch, so that sort of slows the system down slightly. There's benefits to both. We've always done post-commit reviews, and we're quite happy with that.
The process from going from 2 weeks to 30 minutes took how long, and what kind of resource commitment did you have to make to make that transition?
So the question was, what resource and time did it take to go from 2 weeks to 30 minutes deploy time? It probably took us 3 or 4 months, I would say, time-wise. It's very difficult to put a time on that. It's very difficult to say accurately how long it would take in any team. For us, we sort of did it on the side because we've been spending a lot of time on getting the 4.0 editor going, and we did this on the side. We basically had one person allocated to it for 50% of his time, something like that, and he had to write the deploy scripts and stuff. So I would say half a person it took us for 3 to 4 months. Depends on your environment. One more?
First of all, I got to say that the entire philosophy of doing an issue-based deployment is absolutely brilliant. However, I kind of want to see that when you were talking about that and how everything's structured, it looks like it's only going to be supported on a DBCS infrastructure. Would you say that's about true?
I wouldn't like to say either way. We are, on the Confluence team, we're moving to Git very soon. And so, for instance, the slide I showed before, picking specific issues off, there's different ways you can do that. So one way you can do that, a clean way you can do that, is to branch from the for every issue, create a branch off your deployment branch, make your changes there, submit that, and then submit that to trunk or master or default, and then when the system is happy with the changes, when you've moved that through, then they get merged back onto the deployment branch. So everyone is branching one direction and it's merging the stuff back across. So that's one way of doing it. Another way, which is potentially slightly more risky but would work for a non-distributed version control, is to have a system which just cherry picks the changes across. So if you know this issue, if you know issue X is completed, you know the commits associated with that issue, you can do a pretty good job of picking out those commits, pushing the diffs across to another branch, and most of the time it's going to work. It's not going to work if you have a dependency on something else which is partially done, but you can set up that dependency in Jira. So Jira should be able to know if it's dependent on another issue and not merge that across. You still may get a few merge conflicts, but if this merge is being done as part of a build, the build goes red, someone has to go and fix it, but as long as that's not happening all the time, it shouldn't be a problem. Either way, I don't want to promise it, but I don't see any reason why it is not possible for a non-distributed system.
Thank you. A big round of applause.